Let me start off this video with some statements that may be considered a little bit controversial. 1. What makes Breath of the Wild one of the most effective and important open world experiences that we've seen in the past few years? I know a lot of people throw that around, but an equally large number of people just straight up don't get it. They just don't understand the hype, and they can't see why this game would be considered anything even remotely special comparatively to other open world games. And 2. How does NieR Automata present its narrative in an incredibly unique and fulfilling way that passes along its thematic elements as effectively as possible? NieR Automata has a linear narrative that's not structured to dwell on smaller narrative moments, so how is it so insanely good at passing along its message while retaining player interest? Now, there could be a lot of specified answers to these questions if you ask different people, but the commonality that I see between Breath of the Wild and NieR Automata is that they both revolve heavily around player choice. And I think that point of intersection is by far the most important point to harp on. I would argue that the implementation of this point is the very reason that these games are both so successful in what they set out to do. However, before we move on to discussing player choice within the context of these games, I think it's beneficial to briefly go over exactly what I mean when I say player choice. Player choice is frequently feigned in games to make players feel like they have infinite possibilities on how to proceed or are part of the unfolding narrative. These actions tend to have no real bearing on the way the game or story progresses, however, as many games tend to block the player from continuing on a certain path, or they only change minor bits of text when a certain dialogue option is chosen, or sometimes they just don't change anything at all, text included. And let me be clear, there's nothing inherently wrong with this way of implementing player choice, but it certainly isn't meaningful. When implemented to its full effect, player choice alters the way the player interacts with the world and story, and I'll be focusing on how genuine player choice can benefit the gameplay and narrative experience through examples of NieR Automata and Breath of the Wild. Both handle very different applications of player choice, so this video will be segmented into two parts: the Breath of the Wild section and the NieR Automata section. So, without further ado, Breath of the Wild. It was by far the most truly freeform open-world game we had ever received at the time of release back in 2017. Other games had invisible walls that barred you from accessing certain areas of the world, and some forced you to have specific things before you could go and explore that one area off in the distance. Breath of the Wild, however, employs complete and total freedom in player progression. If you see it, you can walk to it, and that is what makes Breath of the Wild so innovative. The player can beat the final boss out of the gate or explore the world to see what it has to offer, with progress really only being halted by player competence. Story events are optional, and the narrative can be completely skipped in favor of screwing around for the next 100 hours, or pulling up to Calamity Ganon with a tree branch and a pot lid. No invisible walls, no items withheld from you after the first hour, and no limitations outside of stamina and how much of a beating you can take. And after returning to this game after a few years, I remembered how well this was employed throughout. For one example, when I arrived at my first crossroads after gaining access to my paraglider, the game showed me two potential paths to take: the intended path towards your first village and Hyrule Castle. So, what was my decision? I just turned around and went in the opposite direction of both, which is entirely viable. The game is clearly crafted in a way that allows players to choose their adventure, rather than be led on one, while still subtly leading new players down an intended path for the most optimal and comfortable first experience as to not alienate or overwhelm them. Through an intricate and delicate balancing act, it caters to multiple audiences at once without handholding and limiting player choice for the sake of not leaving newbies behind. Player choice completely redefines the way the game is played, creating a different experience for every individual person in every single playthrough. This is different from other open world games at the time because many still followed a linear structure that forced certain criteria to be met before progression could occur. I suppose many allowed you to ignore the main objective and do whatever you wanted, but unlike Breath of the Wild, few allowed you to make progress in this way. In Breath of the Wild's case, progression is dictated solely by the player, and that comfortable freeform nature is why player choice benefits the gameplay experience greatly and makes it so easy for anyone to hop into. The incredible depth player choice brings to a gameplay experience can also extend to the narrative experience. Now, having an open narrative that's entirely dependent on the player's decision can lead to the type of narrative we see in Breath of the Wild. Clunky, poorly expressed, and rather disjointed from the gameplay experience. But a story that implements player choice does not have to suffer from the same issues that an open narrative like Breath of the Wild does. That begs an entirely different question, however. With a story that has linear progression, how can player choice affect a developer's communication of the story to their player base? By far, the perfect shining example of this idea is, without a doubt, NieR Automata. NieR Automata is one of the most narratively rich games I have ever played, and it's not because it has gripping small moments that create a fascinating experience scene by scene. NieR Automata so effectively communicates its message and themes because it places the player directly into the narrative through the decisions they make, thus highlighting underlying meanings as well as allowing players to decide their own interpretations of the scenario and its outcome. However, before we discuss this in depth, I want to clarify that 1, there will be spoilers for NieR Automata in this section, if you couldn't guess. And 2, while NieR Automata has many specific narrative instances dictated by player choice, I'll only be focusing on a singular specific story moment for the sake of brevity. Lord knows I'd love to do a full-on analysis of this game's overarching theme, story beat by story beat, but that would be a massive undertaking and not something that's in the cards for today. So, with all that out of the way, let's discuss Pascal. Pascal is an intelligent machine that opts for peace over violence and reads books about the human psyche. He works to create a village of peaceful machines that closely mirrors that of a human society, going as far as to teach the machine children of the many human emotions that he had learned through his research. During Route C, Chapter 14, this decision begins to cause unforeseen problems after disaster strikes. Many of the machines within the village suddenly shift behavior and begin eating each other. This prompts A2 and Pascal to move the children from the once peaceful village to a safer location, the abandoned factory. Which does not sound safe at all, but it is, I assure you. After arriving at the location, everything continues to spiral out of control as a massive group of machine life forms begin attacking the abandoned factory. This leads to both A2 and Pascal fighting off the machines together while leaving the children alone for a brief moment. A2 and Pascal fight with everything they have to save the children, but despite this, because Pascal taught the children fear in an attempt to make them avoid danger, they committed suicide thinking that, in death, they would avoid the onslaught and mutilation of the machines. The death of the machine children, who once didn't understand human emotion, is on Pascal's hands and conscience. Without his teachings, they would have never been driven to such extremes. Given this turn of events, Pascal asks A2 to make a choice.
I cannot live with this heartbreak inside me. I need you. I need you to delete my memories. And if not, then I need you to kill me.
The player can make the decision to kill Pascal or interact with him and wipe his memories, altering the machine village from this point onwards. If you kill Pascal, he will never show up in the game ever again. However, if you wipe his memories, you'll be able to find him selling the parts of the dead machine children back in the now empty village. Wow, both of those options kind of suck, don't they? Pascal made a decision to teach the children fear, and this decision caused them to live under fear and let it control them to the point that they committed suicide. Killing Pascal or making him forget his mistakes doesn't solve the issue at hand. In ignorance and in death, Pascal will never be able to understand his mistakes and learn from them, thus preventing a similar situation from happening again. If we kill him, he's dead. Not much you can do if that option is chosen, I suppose. But at this point in the story, many players will have a deep connection to this character, being unwilling to commit the act. But if we erase his memories, he's bound to repeat the same mistake, over and over and over again. Luckily for us, the game does something not many others do. Throughout NieR Automata, you can frequently avoid undesirable options by simply walking away and not making one of the decisions the game says you should make. A few of the alternative endings actually revolve around running away from the action at hand. Similarly to these alternative endings, Pascal's fate had one unmentioned option: walking away without doing anything, forcing Pascal to live with his grief and grow from his mistakes.
How could you? A2.
The player has a multitude of choices on how to make the story proceed, even choices that aren't outright stated. In making one of these three decisions, the weight of your choices are felt directly and clearly in the world, as the characters interact differently depending on how you go forward, making your decisions as a player feel meaningful. And this is hardly the first and last time this tactic is employed throughout the game. At every corner, under every rock, there are alternative endings that are influenced by how the player decides to act, with 3 found in the very chapter where Pascal's plea takes place. In fact, the true ending of this game asks one of the most difficult and meaningful questions of the player that I have ever seen in a video game. It asks the player to make a genuine sacrifice of their own time and effort in order to benefit other players, making that moment of player choice meaningful to people in the real world. Wow, that is really cool. And it's also a bit hard to give full context for that ending in a relatively short video, so I won't go too in-depth into that any further, but just know that this game never stops giving the player a purposeful and significant decision to make. The point is, as players, we are given the decision to alter the world as we see fit and take the actions we believe are appropriate to alleviate the situation. Our actions are reinforced and responded to us by the game world around us, encouraging and rewarding player choice. It should also be said, in seeing the effects of our actions, we unveil the alternative purpose of player choice in NieR Automata. Going back to our Pascal situation for just a little bit, it's very clear to me that the game is trying to portray walking away as the best option, as it provides arguably the best outcome. This allows underlying themes about responsibility and growth to show themselves in full force. That's not the key takeaway from this situation, trust me, I'm aware, but it does provide a sub-theme that beautifully complements the overall message of the scenario, effectively passing along the thematic message through the way the player interacts with the supporting cast. Despite what I've just said, allowing Pascal to live with his past mistakes is not the only answer, as the entire situation is a bit more morally ambiguous than I'm portraying it. I know a large number of people may be inclined to ease the pain of their newfound friend instead of letting it fester over time or just straight up killing them. And who knows, maybe there's some asshole out there who just really wants Pascal to die. But the point is, players can craft the narrative around their own moral compass and logical thought processes and derive meaning out of their actions and the game's response to those actions themselves. What I've said is a singular interpretation of a complex scenario. NieR Automata is, as such, not a simple story created only by the developer. Fleshing out the world is, in a sense, the collaborative effort between the game designer and the player. This creates a gripping narrative that provides as much nuance and impact as the player decides to put into it, and it all revolves around player choice. So, with all that said, let's touch base by going back to my previous statements. 1. What makes Breath of the Wild one of the most effective and important open-world experiences that we've seen in the past few years? Player choice in Breath of the Wild allows players true freedom by not locking their progression behind almost anything, thus allowing them to craft their own adventure and progress through the game as they please, being as prepared or unprepared as they see fit, not as the developer sees fit. True player choice creates the adventure, not strictly the developer, which can benefit a large range of audiences. And number 2, how does NieR Automata present its narrative in an incredibly unique and fulfilling way that passes along its thematic elements as effectively as possible? Player choice allows for underlying thematic elements to surface and gives the player the prerogative to craft a portion of the narrative, seeing the effects of their actions take hold on the characters around them. Players hold the key to story progression, which makes for a wonderful dance between the developer's intent and the player's intent, bolstering the narrative experience and impact. So, now that I've fully explained myself, hopefully you can see why Breath of the Wild and NieR Automata do such an effective job at exploring and employing player choice. But, let me be clear. I love player choice. It's an amazing agent for audience engagement and enjoyment, but it will always be limited. Breath of the Wild is incredibly open, but there are only so many places you can effectively reach without proper preparation. Well, through normal means at least. And NieR Automata can only accommodate for so many ideas that the player may have to progress the plot. Making the effort to create an environment where player choice can thrive is a surefire way to make the player be interested in the game's gameplay and narrative progression, but it's certainly not necessary, and isn't always that feasible to include into specific genres or stories. Most of the games I enjoy feign player choice, and it's not a big deal. Games can be as open or as linear as they want, and it does not entirely dictate how enjoyable that game will be. But I do think player choice is an incredibly useful tool to discuss and utilize moving forward. As time and technology progresses, more games create vast worlds with scope never before seen in the gaming industry. And as these games continue to come out of the waterworks, player choice will become an element more and more worth discussing. Not only does player choice benefit many experiences, but it's also what a lot of developers have been looking to for the future of their franchises. So it's beneficial to get used to, because it sure ain't going anywhere anytime soon. Thanks for watching this video, I really appreciate you sticking with it, and if you're interested in learning a bit more about Pascal, check the comments section down below, because I wrote a little excerpt that I really couldn't fit into this video logically, so check it out. It has to do with some really fun 17th century philosophy, 17th century philosophy, so check that out if you're interested, and I will see you in whatever video I decide to make next.